in the classic Cold War between West and the Soviet Union, the only Russian product that the average person could buy or would want to buy was vodka. There were no consumer goods, there were no electronic goods, and so on. And if you like, the technological controls the West had was to prevent the sale of high tech computers and so on to the Soviet Union, which could be of use to its military, which was its main, as it were, threat challenge to us. Whereas today, if you think about it, the technological controls we want are to stop Huawei, to stop Chinese companies having a quasi monopoly position, or at least a powerful position in the infrastructure of everyday life, even more with the development of things like 5G. So we are facing a challenge which is a much more potent one.
Hello and welcome to Reasoned UK with me, Darren Grimes. We're the channel that asks you to think more and follow less. This is the last interview that I have before Christmas, but boy oh boy are you in for a treat. Mark Almond is best known, I think, to most of us as a columnist who writes, I think, really quite thought-provoking and let's be honest, quite punchy pieces too. He is an excellent columnist. He was for many years a lecturer in modern history at Oriel College in Oxford, and I am delighted that he's given up his time to speak to me today. But please do consider hitting that subscribe button, the notification bell as well, if you enjoy today's show. Hello, Mark, from a very rainy Oxford, I hear.
Indeed, very overcast. It's almost as though it's the middle of the night rather than the late morning. Very, very good to talk to you, Darren.
Well, no, thank you again. I really am looking forward to this. Now, I wonder, Mark, if we might start, if I can ask a really quite... well, actually, I'll get on to the impertinent question in a moment, but would you describe yourself, Mark, as a conservative in the sort of small c scrutinite tradition?
Yes. I sometimes have been called a Tory anarchist in the sense that I have conservative views on all sorts of matters, but I also perhaps can snipe at the Conservative Party because very often one feels that it isn't really living up to its name.
One thought I'd like you to explore is, I think the problem with the big C Conservative Party is that it isn't any longer anchored in small c conservative principles. And I'm wondering if I'm thinking of the Conservative Philosophy Group and all of these other fantastic outfits, for example. Do you think that's the problem? Do you think that there just isn't anything anchoring the Conservative Party? So it's sort of, I'm thinking of the really depressing, and we're going to get onto this later, but I'm thinking of the really depressing way in which there were reports in the Financial Times where when Dominic Cummings left Number 10, apparently someone from Number 10 said that we need to govern in a more Biden-Harris way of doing things. And I just thought, we are not some satellite state of the United States of America. You know, that's just such a depressing response from a party with an 80-seat majority.
Yeah. I see, for instance, I think there is this problem, isn't there, of a kind of deference in British politics and conservative politics to finding a foreign model. For many years, the European Union was seen as being the solution to all our problems, the problems that Britain undoubtedly had through the 60s and 70s. And so there's been this kind of looking offshore for a guru to guide us. And personally, I think in many ways, obviously, Britain's alliance with the United States over the last 80 years has been generally to the benefit of this country. But I think there is a difference between being an ally and a loyal ally and being, as you say, subservient and wanting to curry favor. Whereas in practice, for both sides of an alliance, even when there's a disproportion in the power and influence between the different partners, it's more useful to have diversity. That's one of my underlying criticisms of the European Union approach, has been that it's a one-size-fits-all approach. And one of the great advantages that Europe as a continent, as a relatively small continent, a sort of tip at the end of Asia, has had over the last few hundred years has been precisely that it has been a rather diverse region where, yes, there have been conflicts, but also there has been a situation where at any given moment, one or two states have got the right answer to problems and others are making mistakes. And you can adjust your policies to see what works. Whereas if you then try to say, here is a model that works today, has worked in the past, and must therefore work in the future, you really are tying yourself into a very short-sighted approach where you risk the whole group of states making one big mistake together. And I think we can see, for instance, with the way the euro as a currency functioned to depress the economies of Mediterranean Europe, for instance, was one of those examples. Coming back to your point about, if you like, the lack of bottom in
Mm.
the Conservative Party, to use that old-fashioned term, it is, I think, an interesting phenomenon. It's also a phenomenon, perhaps, of all political parties, that as the political elite has become professionalized from a relatively young age, people go into politics at university, they become SPADs and so on. They become MPs, they become ministers. They are, in a way, even very intelligent people are so much involved in the nitty-gritty of policy and also in the nitty-gritty of climbing the greasy pole that they lose sight of the ethical and philosophical underpinnings and the basis in society. Now, I have to say, you could say this time last year in the general election, it seemed that Boris Johnson's Conservative Party had decided to make a broad big C and small c Conservative appeal, and it revealed that there were very large numbers of people up north and in the Midlands and so on who had previously either not voted Conservative or hadn't voted Conservative for a
Absolutely.
long time, who felt that what the Tories were saying chimed in with their views about their country, about identity, because we often talk about identity politics as only being a matter for minorities. But what happens if the majority feels that its identity has been ignored or trampled on or traduced? And that it's potentially a dangerous moment too.
Now, that leads me on then to asking the question I suggested might be really rather impertinent, which is throughout your career, you've penned pieces for national newspapers, right? That's not a recent phenomenon. You've been going and doing this for quite some time. Papers of left and right, yes?
Well, yes, if people ask me, to write, and I'm able to write what I think, yeah.
Now, and that's whilst being a lecturer at Oxford. I'm just wondering, do you think, and this has just sort of occurred to me earlier this morning, do you think then if you were just starting out in your career now, given that you've just said you're a small c Conservative and all the rest of it, and managed to put forward your case there for what the problem is with the big C Conservative Party, would you find it difficult in an age of growing intolerance and cancellation to start out in your career now, both as a lecturer at Oxford and as a columnist for newspapers of all political persuasions?
Well, there are two aspects, aren't there? Perhaps we become part of the, obviously one issue today is the media is under pressure because the very instrument that we're using at the moment, the internet, has been a huge blow to the financial viability of the classic media, particularly the newspapers. So if I was talking to one of my students only the other week, and she was asking about how does one get into the media, and I had to say, well, it is more difficult now than probably ever because there are fewer economically viable outlets. So there's that question. Then there's the question of a more censorious society as a whole, and I think I've had various scrapes with the academic consensus over the years because that's been around for a long time. I think one of the ironies that people often talk about in terms of defending academic freedom is, things like issues like tenure, that scholars should be protected from external pressures to conform, which is undoubtedly a good idea. And the idea was that if you had people who had lifetime or long-term tenure in university, they would be free to develop their ideas, to put them forward, and to face the brickbats without risking economic collapse and isolation if being sacked, whatever. But in practice, one of the great problems, I think, in not just British universities, but across the Western world, is the so-called, perhaps tenured radical is too generous a term, the tenured consensus, the tenured conformists, who, despite the fact that they don't face any threat to their position, are desperately anxious to waft in the wind and to avoid controversy. And I think we have seen, therefore, a decline in debate. And you can see this, in a sense, to left and right. That there's been a desperate attempt to say that these are the notions that we should be spreading. In a sense, you could say, and this is rather harsh on the medieval university, but we're returning to a position where the academics have become clerics who are imposing orthodoxies and dogmas. And being able to parrot those has become more important than questioning them. And we can think, can't we, of almost any great scientific development has been based upon challenging the consensus. After all, Galileo would not be able to publish today because the Ptolemaic consensus would say that his ideas about the solar system were unacceptable to the great bulk of scientists.
Mm.
Or famously, people have pointed out Einstein would not be able to get
Mm-hmm.
relativity into a physics journal, just to take areas of science. But we can think also of areas which perhaps people would think of as more obviously controversial, affecting daily life. And so I don't think people should necessarily go out of their way to be awkward or contrarian for its own sake, even if sometimes one is accused of that.
Mm.
But on the other hand, gadflies serve a useful function, and if you don't have them, you get a very sterile and ultimately rather brain dead world. And I think this has, in a sense, filtered also into much of the public debate, the domain of fact checking and so on. That often the fact checkers are simply people who are repeating the consensus. They don't
Yeah.
actually know whether the facts are true or not.
Mm.
That is a danger, that you end up with a cozy consensus that turns out not to be able to handle the challenges of the real world, and then suddenly, a bit like the cozy consensus on board the Titanic, you're heading for the iceberg, and
Yes,
nobody's allowed to say, look what's over there.
somewhat like, back in the days when we thought the Earth was completely flat, Twitter putting a warning below a
Mm.
label saying, "Well, actually, the world is round," saying this claim
Yeah,
isn't verified. Sort
yeah,
of that
yeah, yeah.
consensus view.
Well, as I say, Galileo would have did face this problem, that the consensus view of people who had a very, very sophisticated understanding of the universe, it's just that it was completely wrong, but there were many more of them than him.
Hmm.
Just as a small point, obviously Galileo has been sort of sanctified as a secular saint, but in fact he was a very devout Catholic who believed
Mm.
that his telescope and so on had opened up the glories of God's created universe, because he'd shown how much bigger it was than his critics in the universities thought, and how much more complex it was. But anyway, but obviously this is also one of the things that happens to people, isn't it? Nietzsche made this point: when you say something, as soon as you've said it or printed it, immediately the words become the property of the people listening to your reading, and they will come to conclusions that you hadn't anticipated. Sometimes they,
Mm.
of course, come to better conclusions, but quite often they attribute to you views that you didn't hold.
Now,
Anybody who writes in newspapers knows you get letters saying, "I'm so glad that you said X," when you spent 1,000 words explaining why X is the wrong idea.
yes. Now, do you think though there's an element of, and I don't know if you've sort of
Yeah.
because you seem to suggest it's really not a recent phenomenon, but
Yeah.
there seems to be this idea that we've returned to the days of the Salem witch
Yeah.
trials, and I wonder if you've found that at Oxford, where this has become a worsening phenomenon, or
Yeah.
whether or not actually you think it's always been there, but social media has just sort of amplified the problem.
Yeah. Well, I think if you like, the witch hunting mentality, no doubt, is certainly as old as human history. So it's several thousand years old and possibly precedes it. But it does manifest itself in different ways. And it's also, I'm quite interested often in the ironies of these things. Back in the summer, there was a demonstration outside Oriel to call for the pulling down of the statue of Rhodes on the Rhodes
Mm.
building that he funded. And there were various people holding posters, and one young chap was holding a poster saying, "Burn him." And he was actually standing in front of the church on the other side of the street, in whose now library convocation room the trial of Latimer, Cranmer, and Ridley took place, where they were burned for being heretics.
Mm.
It seemed to be this lack of historical sense that my belief that I am absolutely morally correct and I have no shadows over my motivations or the likely consequences of my intolerance, because how can I be called intolerant because I am supporting worthy causes? And the failure to see that there have been witch hunters and Puritans of various kinds over the centuries that have also had these powerful senses that something terrible, a terrible injustice or a terrible immorality has to be fought and suppressed, and nothing should stand in the way of that
Mm.
cause. And I think that one of the things, in a sense, which tends to make people perhaps more conservative, is a sense of history, a sense that not necessarily that things repeat themselves, but nonetheless that there are aspects of what's gone on in the past that we can, at the very least, try to avoid making those mistakes again. And often we end up making new ones, perhaps. But the once you have a dehistoricized society, where people really don't have any sense of what went on in the past, you fail to see that sometimes you're just acting out a kind of parody of something that went on before. And so we have a kind of new types of Puritanism, people who would obviously not share the kind of classic 17th century Puritans' moral values, but they do share the kind of mentality and motivation to impose themselves on other people. The killjoy attitude. You can see it even with those people who seem to want to have a lockdown over Christmas as much because they want to suppress people having, celebrating Christmas together, and so on, as because they are trying to combat a disease. So if we distinguish between the reason why you say you want to do something and then your motivation for doing it,
Yeah.
are often rather contradictory.
Now, moving on slightly, you sort of touched on this earlier in your remarks on the European Union,
Yeah.
but imagine that there's a Brexit deal announced this week before Christmas. Our negotiators managed to get home for Christmas. They're all a bit
Yeah.
bleary-eyed. They're all a bit sick
Yeah.
of talking over and over again about fish quotas and all the rest of it. And whilst there might be some chest beating from Brussels, Mark, in how far they've managed to nudge the British Prime Minister, you actually argue that the EU's jubilant tone will be very much short-lived. And I wonder if you might explain what some of the monumental problems that face the EU
Yeah.
on almost every front actually are, because an argument we often hear, Mark, is that far from encouraging others to make a break for the exit door and for freedom, the EU has actually been united by Brexit.
Well, I think we have to, if you like, distinguish between the governments of the 27 members and the peoples, because we can see, can't we, that many of the political problems of countries across Europe, for instance, the rise of far-right parties, the falling in participation in elections and so on, is partly because there's a sense that politics has been taken away from the local, national context, and everything is decided in Brussels. And we saw it in our own country for many years, didn't we? If a government wanted to do something unpopular, it would say, "Oh well, Europe has decided on that." We would rather not do it ourselves, but nonetheless, this is a European thing. And so you have, ironically, the EU, which in a sense emerged out of the failure of fascism in the Second World War, and also the Cold War, the fear of communism, two as it were great dictatorial ideologies, has become a kind of managerial approach to life, and where everything is mediated and negotiated between elites. Now, you
And
need
that's
elites in politics.
exemplified, of course, in the presidency of the European Commission with Ursula von der Leyen, whose father was the founder, wasn't he?
Yes, a founding bureaucrat, as it were. Yeah, yeah. You have dynasties and insiders and so on. And also, Ursula von der Leyen is one of those people who, in a sense, epitomizes the problem of how you get to the top in Europe, which is not being very popular in your own country. Think of Neil Kinnock in our country. He became vice president of the European Commission because he failed to win the 1992 election and so on. And she was, in many ways, the anointed, expected successor to Angela Merkel as Chancellor of Germany. She had been, as you say, from a kind of CDU political bureaucratic family that had been really very much in power in West Germany and then in the United Germany. And yet, when she got high office in Berlin, everything she touched went wrong. And she was, as Minister of Defence, which was supposed to give her a profile as a strong, if you like, Thatcherite lady. Remember Mrs. Thatcher in her chieftain tank and so on. And in fact, she produced a situation which was that the German army. A German army was training with broomsticks and wooden weapons because there wasn't the money to pay for routine equipment, but huge amounts of money were being spent on ill-conceived projects and on consultants and so on. And shall we say, one of the phenomena of the modern economy is the emergence of the consultant class. And I'm inclined to think this is not a wholly good idea. I don't think bureaucrats necessarily should be deferred to, but equally the consultant class has become a kind of parasitical body which preaches free market solutions, but in fact depends almost entirely upon the taxpayer for its living, in this, certainly in the role of consulting company. And in that sense, she became part of a strange blob mixing a kind of internal German elite that was also very highly strategically placed within the European institutions in Brussels and so on to get their person or their people to the top. And then also part of a process in the last 30 years where we've had, it seems to me very often, this paradox of the rhetoric of free markets and competition But in fact, regulation has grown apace. If I could just mention poor old David Graeber, who ended up teaching at the LSE, but who was an American, very left-wing anarchist, but actually somebody that I think people of the conservative right should listen to, because he, as a sociologist and an anthropologist, was very perceptive about the way in which regulation has flourished, bloviated, you could almost say, uh, despite the apparent triumph of capitalism, because what we see, and this comes to some extent even to your cancellation culture, isn't it, that there's a whole army of human resources people, regulators, controllers, discipliners. You see it in universities, how now um, the entry into colleges and university buildings is all with electronic cards, and you have to go through certain kind of control points. And the kind of freedom of people being able to wander into a lecture hall or into a college or university building has really been replaced now by these kind of elements of control, which are justified because of security and so on. But in a sense, it's partly because of the growth of bureaucracy. I remember when I first came to Oxford, the history faculty had one full-time secretary and a half-time secretary. Now it seems to have about 38 people who are busily helping to, as it were, run scholarship. And so we've seen this, as I say, this proliferation of bureaucracy and regulation, even at the same time as we've had a rhetoric of marketization. And so I think one of the things I always feel we have to be careful of is becoming ideologues and saying that provided the right words are used, um, and if you like, the right incantations are recited, that's okay, rather than asking what do the words mean? Do they sometimes disguise the truth?
On the EU point, I think that's probably exemplified by the way in which the EU is pushing for us to accept all of these state aid rules, whilst they
Yeah,
are fattening the goose, as it were,
yeah,
across the continent.
yeah.
And that sort of, I think, highlights your point on it being the sick man of Europe, which, of course, in the 70s was what the label in which we attached to ourselves.
Yeah, yeah. And I think we can see, can't we, that under the guise of being a club, not everybody's equal. Famously, when the East European post communist countries were admitted, President Chirac of France told them to be quiet and sit at the back of the class like good boys, and also arranged that, for instance, the common agricultural policy would subsidize West European cattle far more generously than East European cattle. So at least some cows were more equal than others. And we saw, for instance, when it has come to deficit financing, when there have been economic problems in places like Portugal, Spain, and Greece, they have been urged to accept very austere conditions and have serious cuts in public expenditure on things like health and education and so on, which are quite important. We may discuss all the better ways of funding them, but allowing that they are being funded by the state in the first place. And yet, when France or Germany had serious budgetary problems and went over the 3% limit, there were no consequences because they were powerful states. And I think this is where, to some extent, if you like, the ideologues of Europe and the people who want to believe in an ideal Europe with its blue flag, rather like people who believe in the United Nations with its blue helmets, they tend to sanctify an image and not really to question what is really going on. And the reality is that Europe is a large body which is attempting to regulate all sorts of aspects of more than 500 million people's lives and economies. And at the same time, there are some people and some groups within that organization who are better positioned to make the rules, to break the rules, and to impose the penalties that they want. And I think that is why Britain, in a sense, felt that this was an inappropriate mechanism to guide our lives. And that's why I think also, mentioning earlier, we see this growing gulf between populations, electorates, and bureaucrats and elites, because in a sense you can see, can't you, that if you live in London and if you mix with the, as it were, the Whitehall mandarins, for them, and if you like, mandarins around the world, Brussels is almost the mecca of mandarinates. It's the ideal model. But if you are an ordinary person, a voter, a business person, whatever, then you may well feel that is a very alien culture and almost a hostile one. And that's, we have this big, it's a big gulf in society between parts of an elite that feels deeply threatened by what they call populism. And of course, partly because of the, if you like, the marginalizing of criticism you've had, it also tends to become more extreme. And we can think, therefore, in some countries, in Germany, France, Italy, the Eurosceptics are also quite often associated with a more authoritarian nationalistic past. Whereas, shall we say, in Britain, if you like, an important part of the national culture is that British patriotism is based on the idea that British people are free. Rule Britannia, they will never be slaves. It's nothing to do with Caribbean slavery. It's to do with, unlike Louis XIV, Louis XV's France, the British people had elections, could say what they want. Even the people who didn't have the vote could go to the hustings and shout out at the candidates and throw tomatoes and so on. And this was a sharp contrast with absolute enlightened despotisms, which all right-thinking progressive people in the 18th century said, if only we had a Frederick the Great to be a rational, enlightened ruler instead of these competing politicians bawling at each other at election time and so on, how much better off we would be. Well,
I mean, yes, it probably sounds a little bit reductive to say it, but it's in the response to World War II. The UK did not have the same problems or desire to eradicate national sovereignty and the nation state, essentially, which seems to have been what the EU's imperial ambitions are all about.
Yeah, well, it's also, again, it's partly just a matter of different history, isn't it? If you were the generation of Ursula von der Leyen's father, you would say, as a young man, you had lived in Nazi Germany, and you had seen these terrible wars, and so surely national identity was the source, the curse, and we had to get rid of it. And that's understandable. Whereas for people in Britain and many other places, say in the United States too, you can see that a sense of being part of a club of your own, where you have some say in who comes to rule, and where the losers nonetheless have the right to carry on making their points and have a chance to come back. And therefore the belief that making mistakes and being able to toss out the wrong rulers is a good idea. Whereas the European project was really based upon the idea that we can't risk those mistakes because look at how catastrophic they've been. And one can understand that. But as time passes, of course, the danger is that you are so busy solving the problem of 1939-45 that you overlook that you're beginning to create all sorts of tensions and fissures that could well stir up very deep disputes, because we see ironically today, don't we, that the East European countries are being reproached, countries like Poland and Hungary, where we can debate the wisdom of their particular policies, but they are being reproached because they say, the people in Brussels say, you take a lot of subsidy from us, but you don't want to conform to all the list of principles that we regard as essentially what a good government should do. And in Poland and in Hungary, for the moment, you have parties who have been elected by the population who seem to say we'd like to go in a slightly different direction. And so you have now the irony that perhaps it's the children of the communist era who were, in the case of Viktor Orban in Hungary, dissidents against the communists, or in the case of Poland too, who are now becoming dissidents against a grand globalist international design, because partly they had grown up with the Kremlin saying these are the standards that everybody has to meet. Now, the Kremlin's standards were much more catastrophic than the EU standards, but still that basic idea that outside your own polis, outside your own political electorate community, somebody can ultimately say, no, you can't do that, because we are setting a kind of overarching standard, is something that I think grates with people who lived with Mr. Brezhnev in the Kremlin, saying, no, you must return to the normal model of the tanks rolling.
Very, I think that's a very, very good point. But Mark, isn't this conversation just a little bit of a red herring? Shouldn't we be more worried about sovereignty from China, for example, here in the United Kingdom? Because if we consider that, I've just read a stat, 90% of the masks we're obliged to wear come from China. The tech that we're using for this green industrial revolution, which by the way I have great misgivings about, and very deeply skeptical about this massive amounts of state subsidy for this thing that's supposed to save the planet. I just think it's...
Well, also, if you think about the lithium mining, you see, we have the problem, don't we, again, of a kind of mono obsession with one thing. CO2 is bad, so we must do everything we can to stop CO2. But what about places from Central Africa to Bolivia and so on, where vast wastelands are being created by the mining of the various resources you need to make batteries for non-CO2 producing energy production? So there's a huge environmental cost, and I think this the failure of the media to discuss this in any serious way. And for instance, we saw with, say, Michael Moore, who's by no means a conservative figure in America, the fact that he suddenly cancelled having been a hero.
Did you watch it?
I haven't been able to sit through the whole thing, but I've seen some of it. Yes.
I saw the whole thing, and honestly, I fell in love with the man, despite the fact I find him thoroughly, I disagree with him on about everything. And he must think I'm or
Yeah,
you probably compare me to Adolf Hitler or someone like that. But
yeah,
you
yeah,
know,
yeah.
it was an extraordinary documentary, and you're right, he was effectively cancelled for daring to do it.
Yes, yes. And for instance, he has raised questions that on all sorts of issues that really need to be answered, not least by his own side. And I think that's, as it were, the gadfly is useful in society, where people are saying to their own side, sometimes you have to ask yourself awkward questions too, because the way to, if you like, remain intellectually alert and responsive to real problems is to constantly be asking, is this the right answer? Is there another problem, or is there another solution? And sometimes, as I was mentioning, for instance, David Graeber, this anarchist anthropologist, he, because of his learning languages, studying societies, had all sorts of insights, even if his own vision of what he would like society to be was not one that I would share. Nonetheless, he actually was a person who saw things quite clearly that were going on, and which quite often people with whom I might be more sympathetic wouldn't really want to see, because it would, ask awkward questions of ourselves.
No,
Now, coming on your point about China, which I think is very important, we were mentioning earlier, as it were, the classic Cold War period, and I think one of the dangers for the West in general, if you like, for conservative-minded people, is to use this paradigm of the Cold War vis-a-vis China, because if we think back to the 1940s till the end of the 1980s, whatever the challenge the Soviet Union posed to the West, it didn't infiltrate into everyday life in the way that, as you were mentioning, the technology that you and I are using to talk to each other now, all sorts of components, at least, come from China. Maybe the intellectual property is primarily American and
yeah,
European
designed
design,
in California. Yeah.
but assembled in Wuhan, and that is a fundamental difference, isn't it? That in the classic Cold War between West and the Soviet Union, the only Russian product that the average person could buy or would want to buy was vodka. There were no consumer goods, there were no electronic goods, and so on. And if you like, the technological controls the West had was to prevent the sale of high tech computers and so on to the Soviet Union, which could be of use to its military, which was its main, as it were, threat challenge to us. Whereas today, if you think about it, the technological controls we want are to stop Huawei, to stop Chinese companies having a quasi monopoly position, or at least a powerful position in the infrastructure of everyday life, even more with the development of things like 5G. So we are facing a challenge which is a much more potent one. And it's also partly that although China is ruled by a thing called the Communist Party, it's obviously a one party dictatorship. In some ways, it is a party that has managed to marry Mao and the market. People talk sometimes about market Leninism as being the goal of some of the post-communist, ex-communist leaders in the old Soviet bloc, but they didn't really get very far. But we can see in China, you do have this combination of a powerful ruling party with a strong ideological urge for control and supervision, all the degree of digitalization of people, so that you have a kind of social credit system to assess who is a good citizen and who is a bad one, and so on. But it's married to a very potent, productive force. China has become the workshop of the world in the way that Britain was in the middle of the 19th century and the United States was in the middle of the 20th century. And so this is a very, very potent mix of an ideology, a justification for a powerful dictatorial state, and at the same time one that has enormous economic reach and technological reach and investment reach. You only have to think, don't you, compare, say, the Marshall Plan with the Belt and Road Initiative, the so-called New Silk Road. Um, the Chinese are putting, roughly speaking, in modern dollar terms, 7 times as much money into this project, and also perhaps being willing to sustain much more cost to themselves. That many of these projects are not necessarily, certainly in the short term, going to be economically profitable, but they lock countries into Chinese-built infrastructure, railways and other transport facilities, hubs, ports, and so on. And this is something which the West really has to ponder very seriously, because if you have a kind of new Cold War with China, the costs to our society of trying to decouple ourselves from supply chains, whether it's PPE or computer components or everyday items in ordinary supermarkets, there are costs to that. And therefore you have to say, for instance, is the market economy left to itself able to produce a politically, if you like, intellectually principled answer? if we go back, Lenin once famously is supposed to have said that the capitalists would sell the rope to the communists, with which the communists would then hang them because they were so short-sighted in the pursuit of profit.
And
Uh,
that's essentially what we're doing now, isn't it?
well, there's a
Not
risk of
quite,
that.
but
Yeah, but there's
yeah,
a risk
there's
of
a
that, isn't there?
risk.
Yes, yeah, and particularly also maybe not so much directly to us here in Britain, in the sense that I don't think that the People's Liberation Army is going to occupy Whitehall in the foreseeable future or ever. But on the other hand, we can see in relation to places like Hong Kong, but also many other places in Asia, that there are powerful business and banking interests who make so much money out of trading with China that they lobby to avoid the questions of human rights and the questions of, for instance, in Hong Kong, the degree to which Hong Kong is being reduced to the status of just another part of China. And ironically, the very success of Shanghai and Canton and all these cities that until 1949 were big centers of trade and the capitalist economy, that they have in the last 40 years under this market Maoism come back to enormous commercial and financial vibrancy, has meant that big Western corporations, and I'm not just thinking about banks like HSBC, but think about Boeing, for instance, and for that matter, Airbus selling aeroplanes and so on, one of the few things we're able to export to China.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they have quite powerful lobbying to say, let's not get over concerned about
Yes.
the odd dissident being locked up or whatever.
And some, I mean, it might be. I don't know what you think about this, but one idea is that we should encourage, these the sort of countries in Africa, for example, economies in Africa, that are basically now shackled to China as far as their debt's concerned, building up vast
Yeah,
debts at
yeah.
low rates and all the rest of it, to just say to them, default on your loans and we'll make sure it doesn't affect your international credit rating. Could we do that sort of thing? What's the solution to, as
Yeah.
far as the West's concerned?
Well, there is a problem, isn't it? For quite a few countries, we see, for instance, the various twists and turns, say, in Zambian politics, where you essentially have an economy based on copper. And who buys the copper? Well, China, because who is making all the things that use copper in the electronic infrastructure? China. And so you do face the problem, and I think this is where, in a sense, the interlinking of the Chinese economy with the world economy, with the Western economies, makes an attempt to decouple potentially costly. Because if you say default, then you still say to these countries, what are you going to do afterwards? Because
Yeah.
if you're as it were, customer is still to a great extent going to be China. We can think a country like Australia is, we can talk about countries, relatively poor countries with a limited developed infrastructure. But look at Australia now. The Chinese have been willing to really, to some extent, cut off their nose to spite their face by, for instance, cutting back sharply on Australian coal exports. Because they're punishing Australia as, if you like, potentially the weak link in the classic Western states in the Asia Pacific region. And on the other hand, what do those big producers of raw materials in Australia, not just coal, but all the metals and so on, do if China diversifies? What do producers of Australian wine and foodstuffs do? Because so much of what they export is sold to the biggest single market in the world, which happens also to be relatively proximate to Australia. So these are very big challenges, and I think one of the things we have to think about is that you need to think strategically, so that there isn't going to be a simple answer that you can say, we'll do this, and in a year's time you'll see everything's now better. There are actually going to be quite long-term downsides if you want to decouple, and quite costly ones. And also, you should be therefore having to explain to the public that this is going to put, things going to be a bit more expensive. Now, I'm going to be slightly more optimistic. I hate to be optimistic because I'm by nature. Pius IX famously ruled that optimism was an error because it presumed on God's mercy, but pessimism was a sin because it denied it. And I think there's a danger of being too pessimistic. Because if we think about modern China, in a way, it's as if Chiang Kai-shek had won the Civil War. His regime, after all, on Taiwan, in many ways pioneered the policies that China today pursues on a grand scale. That you had a one-party state. After all, the Kuomintang, the nationalist Chinese party, was a left-wing party that had a lot of links with the Soviet Union in the 20s into the 30s before the Communist Party became its local big rival. But Chiang Kai-shek pioneered this kind of development of a dictatorial market economy, a developmental economy that began to produce all sorts of goods that Western countries would buy rather than being dependent on importing them from it. And if we think about it, Taiwan today has a multi-party system, a dynamic political system, and one that obviously the majority of people have voted for a candidate that the Chinese government in Beijing would not want to have. So it's possible, I think, also to imagine that China itself could evolve out of this current dictatorial model, which seems so potent and dangerous to us, that it could keep the benefits of an economic system that has undoubtedly lifted hundreds and hundreds of millions of people from the dire poverty that Mao imposed on them to a relative affluence, albeit at a political price.
Although I have heard that, or read rather, heard,
Yeah,
as if I've got the ear of
yeah,
China,
yeah.
there is a sort of romanticization of the Mao era. There is a sort of,
Yeah.
we should go back, we should revert to that, and the Gospel of the Little Red Book, for
Yeah.
example.
Well, you have, of course, partly the current leadership generation are people who grew up under Mao, were part of the Cultural Revolution. Ironically, many of the people who were smashing traditional China up as cultural revolutionaries, then, as they became a bit older, became entrepreneurs who also, often, we can see built, demolished whole sectors of Beijing to build condominiums and new blocks of flats and office blocks. So there is a kind of perverse linkage with Mao to the current, as it were, marketized dictatorship. And then also, it is partly, has been, I'm afraid, a shrewd move. What, in a sense, killed communism in the Soviet Union was de-Stalinization. If you say that the man who effectively shaped this communist system for 30 years actually was a tyrant and a monster and a psychopath, then it's very difficult to think that the system that he had designed didn't have those features built in. Whereas if you abandon a lot of Mao's policies, but you still have him on the flag, on the banknotes, in all sorts of public assemblies, statues, and so on, and you still create the idea that there was this godlike, benevolent figure at the founding of the modern China, that has a very powerful psychological resonance. And we can see in North Korea, we can see in Cuba, can't we? Part of the reason why the communist system has survived, not just as it's ruthless and very sophisticated in its repression, is that you didn't decastroize or you didn't dekimize. And so children are brought up with this simple but very powerful narrative that there is they wouldn't say divine, but we can say kind of quasi-divine guiding spirit. And in a way, one of the things that distinguished Western countries, particularly Western democracies and Western constitutional states like Britain, America, and so on, was that we, in that sense, decoupled from making politics sacred and from the cult of personality. And you can think, can't you, in fascist countries, in the 20th century, the great leader, Mussolini, is always right. And of course, one of the great advantages is when he's shown to have got the things very badly wrong, that tends to deflate the system completely with defeat. But I think we therefore face with China, as you say, this very interesting, from the point of view of historical social anthropology, political anthropology, intermingling of apparently contradictory communistic cultish traits with a very successful market-orientated, profit-driven system, albeit that, of course, you have to have good relations with the party to be allowed to make a lot of money, as various people who've fallen out with the party in China, we can see sometimes with Hong Kong entrepreneurs who fall out with the party, then suddenly your business model seizes up and is suppressed. But if you kowtow to the nostrums of Maoist market economy, you can make a lot of money if you're also good at what you do. This is, for instance, part of our problem, coming back to our problem in the West. The companies like Huawei make products that actually do the job. Whereas who would have wanted a Soviet television in the 1980s when you could buy a Toshiba or a Sony one, if I can show my age?
So when you told me that, I thought that really does highlight the problem that we've got. You walk into John Lewis and during the first Cold War, and you wouldn't have thought, well, goodness, I'm going to really be lost if I can't access Russian goods, Russian-made electronics. But I wonder then, how do you think, what will be the response as far as the incoming presidency in the United States is concerned. Because Biden, I don't know if you saw this, but Joe Biden's incoming national security advisor, he quote tweeted a tweet the other day by the news outlet Reuters about China and the EU, aiming for an investment pact by the
Yeah,
end of the year. So this Jake Sullivan, the incoming advisor, he said the Biden-Harris administration would welcome early consultations with our European partners on our common concerns about China's economic practices. Now that struck me as a sort of a knowing nod to do not go down this path or you'll
oh
struggle
yes,
to
yeah.
fall. What do you, am I reading that wrong? What's your
No, well,
interpretation?
I think there's a lot of evidence that the Biden national security team and Biden himself are actually not going to be so different from Trump in terms of the economic and technological constraints they want to place upon China. They probably will be rhetorically rather different from Trump, and also I think probably less mercurial than Trump, because we can remember that Trump originally invited Xi Jinping to Mar-a-Lago and said what a great guy he was, and then subsequently fell out with him, and even overnight he's been tweeting once again about the Chinese virus and so on. So there will be a, if I can put it this way, more statesman-like approach. But I think those people who are saying to the Europeans, you should now be more Biden-Harris-like in the way you operate, are going to discover that their assumptions that you're going to have a complete break with Trump are not the case. And what you're going to have is a break with Trump's rhetoric and style. But in many of these international areas, not least with China, we're likely to see a fairly hard-line policy by the new American administration. And that's going to cause big ruptions with Europe, particularly with Germany, because we tend to forget that the one country that actually sells a lot of things to China from Europe is Germany. You do see Mercedes and BMWs, you see various Siemens products. Many of the big Chinese infrastructure projects have a big German engineering component in them. And so there is a powerful lobby in Berlin, as much as in Brussels, for saying, let's bite our lip about our political differences with China, because it's a huge market and it's a market that we need, not least because the Western economies are wallowing in the post-COVID economic depression still. Whereas China has, even if we don't accept at face value the statistics, I think it's very clear China's economy has recovered much more effectively. And so this again is a big crisis for us, isn't it, in the sense that we have assumed, and not entirely by any means wrongly, that free market democratic societies are, amongst other things, more efficient. One of the lessons of the fascist era was that the fascists marched up and down, goose-stepped, and looked like mechanical machines, that their societies were all highly coordinated and organized. But in practice, after the defeat of Germany and Italy, we would see how chaotic and ill-organized they were, except at killing people. Whereas we now face the problem that to some extent, coming back to this underlying break with the old Cold War past, is that China's economic and, if you like, it's also its bureaucratic structures have turned out in some ways to be more effective at dealing with this crisis than ours have been. And so we are likely to find ourselves confronted by this multi-layered competition with China, whereas on the one hand we want to say, yes, we'd like to step back from being too intimately bound up with them, but have we got the resources, the money, coming back to your point about debt forgiveness to third world countries that may have been enticed into Beijing-funded projects and so on? Do we have the resources both to re-stimulate our own economies and to stimulate other economies around the world?
And surely to stimulate that decoupling process.
Yeah, absolutely, to pay for that. I mean, this is going to be it's quite expensive.
How do we pay for that? As far as do you think we can't rely upon market competition to do that? Can we? Can we rely upon the market to?
Well, I think your point is you can set the boundaries of the market. You can decide, for instance, are some people.
How would you do that? Are you talking tariffs? Are you talking we just can't?
Well, there's obviously, for instance, public projects that the government can decide that it's going to prioritise. This is one of the issues, obviously, with Europe. If we're going to say rebalance the British economy and to some extent revive production in Britain, because I think one of the big problems in Britain, and this is a contrast with, say, Germany, is that we have killed off a lot of technical education in schools. A lot of people go to universities, but they go to study what I call the humanities, if I dignify them, or waffle topics if I don't.
Quack
and
theory.
A lot of, if it's quite a contrast, shall I say, in Germany you still have lots of
Yes, that's
Young people
true.
leave
Yes.
leave school and they go and do technical apprenticeships, and they know how
Mm.
to do things. And we need to recover that. And that again takes 5 or 10 years to find teachers and people to train and invest. But I think we need to, therefore, as I was saying earlier, look at this strategically. You've got to think, how can we promote this? Now, I think if you then make the mistake that we had in the 60s and 70s of the government trying to pick a winner, it almost certainly will not get the right answer.
Mm.
So that's where you have the kind of market situation. The government sets parameters which will encourage local initiative, individual entrepreneurs, companies, investors, including from abroad, to do things that you think are good for the society, good for our economy, good for our security, rather than saying we will decide that X will make this particular thing. We saw, for instance, a huge problem in the 60s and 70s was that the government wanted to promote the northeast of England, and so it made all sorts of rules that made it difficult for people to invest in Coventry and Birmingham and so on, where they might have wanted to invest, and they didn't really want to
Yes.
go. And the things that they wanted to do were not really appropriate to the
Well, it's
traditional.
even splitting off the. I was reading about the splitting off of the different parts of the
Yeah,
steel manufacturing
yeah,
process. So you would,
yeah,
and then that just made it completely uncompetitive because you just had
yeah,
to move about different parts of the country to
yeah,
actually manufacture all the different components of the steel making process. And then
yeah,
China, of course, does it all within one shop, as it were.
yeah.
And it's
Well, you
just
see, so
madness.
the way German businesses have operated more as a vertically integrated project,
Yes,
yeah,
exactly.
and also geographically integrated. Whereas
Mm,
we had, for all sorts of good reasons, obviously that shipping and coal was declining in the northeast of England,
yeah,
and so on. You
yeah.
wanted to find ways of giving people employment, but unfortunately, the mechanism chosen didn't help the people of the northeast of England, and it also helped to stunt growth in other areas where there was as well natural pressure to evolve the economy. So there are big mistakes you can make, but as I say, I think you can set parameters to promote market solutions, but in a sense, in a public interest. And in a sense, we often forget that Adam Smith famously said there are some things more important than opulence. He, for instance, thought defending the country against Louis XV and Louis XVI France was something that the state should do. He wasn't a believer in the privatization of everything. He just thought that a private economy was the best way to produce the wealth that would pay for public goods that you thought the state should provide. We can imagine setting up a framework for public procurement, but also to promote investment, that you set rules to promote a market economy that will produce public goods, public benefits, as market economies should. But you can also say that we're doing this partly because we want to decouple or reduce our dependence, let's say on China or whatever. And so it's possible to do this without making the mistake of thinking that the state can direct specifically investments to particular places or whatever.
Mm.
Um, and I think that is the sensible approach. But as I say, this is also it will take time, and I say partly because there's a huge deficit in education and training in this country in certain areas that we now see we need to be able to have people capable
But
of
it's
doing
good
this.
that we're at least having these conversations,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
It's
yeah,
good
yeah,
that we're noticing these problems. But
yeah,
are you confident then that given the incoming national security advisor's concerns,
yeah,
are you confident that? Well, actually, I think there are two questions from that. One, what do you think the so-called special relationship will actually look like? Because
yeah,
we're surely more aligned with the American line on China than, say, Germany is, for example. But do
yeah.
you see there being a split as far as economies that are so heavily reliant upon China as far as Germany's concerned, as far as its domestic exports, etc.,
Yeah,
and companies' wealth,
yeah,
basically, is concerned? What do you see the sort of splits being? Because I guess the consensus is that Donald Trump quite liked the United Kingdom. It saw us as a sort of but now the Biden administration sees us as an
yeah.
outpost of Trumpism.
Yeah,
So,
so I think yes, shall we say Brexit is seen by the Biden world, as it were, as being British Trumpism, and
mm,
therefore totally negative. Obviously, there's huge
bad, yeah.
bad blood between Biden and Trump, and Biden supporters and Trump supporters, and so there's obviously an element of catch up that a British government has to make to reintegrate itself with a new American administration. But on the other hand, those Europhiles in Britain and those people in the European Union governing structures who assume that a Biden Harris administration is going to be cozy with them are likely to find that, in fact, there are these big issues to do with geopolitics, to do with geo-economic politics, and so on, that Washington is quite likely to be much more abrasive, albeit without the Donald Trump's ineffable rhetoric,
Mm.
than they would like.
Mm.
And this is, I think, going to be one of the tensions with Europe. There are other tensions. For instance, we can see the United States is likely to have very harsh of Turkey because of his policies in relation to the surrounding regions, but also particularly his purchasing of Russian-made anti-aircraft defense systems, which of course are designed to target American aircraft, NATO aircraft. And Germany is still selling weapons to Turkey, and Germany is very anxious to avoid sanctions on Turkey for a mixture of economic self-interest, for a mixture of wanting to continue to control mass migration through Turkey of refugees from the Middle Eastern conflicts and so on. So again, these are tensions that are lurking, and so I think the honeymoon between Biden and Brussels is likely to be fairly short-lived, even if there are all sorts of deep structures as to why the European NATO countries, Britain and the United States, will remain cooperative. But there's likely to be a lot of argy-bargy in that cooperation and tensions over specific policies. And in the longer term, that could begin to erode the transatlantic alliance, because we see somebody we haven't really talked about, President Macron of France, has focused a lot of his criticism on NATO as opposed to more general US policies.
My final question, Mark, to end, I wonder if you might reflect on how you actually see this new Cold War playing out in 2021. We've already spoken about this decoupling and the transition being a sort of decade at least, project almost, that the United Kingdom, the United States might be more up for than we anticipate. But what will it look like over the next year? What have we got to look forward to in 2021? How do you think there'll be a lot more tension, for example, between China and the Western world?
Yes, I think initially there's going to be more tension, and the danger is that if the Chinese government decides that the Western world is both hostile but also to some extent impotent, because it's grappling with huge economic downsides of the pandemic, and also with indecision about how to act collectively, then China might also decide that it can throw its weight around. It may decide, for instance, that it would like to snuff out not just Hong Kong as a kind of liberal enclave, but say Taiwan. Would it risk a conflict there? It, of course, has very bad relations with India. And in a sense, we haven't touched on it, but India represents an alternative Asian super state, but one which, for all Mr. Modi's nationalism, is a democratic state, a multi-party state, and so on, but has not been as successful at developing a kind of global export engine in the way that China has. So will that begin to change, but also will the tensions between India and China over the border and so on possibly lead to a conflict?
And that's a very interesting point, because Mr. Johnson, Boris Johnson, is of course the guest speaker at the Republic Day celebrations in India in January.
Yeah, and so, as I say, India and the West in general, all the democratic countries in their different forms, face this big challenge. How do we manage to, in a sense, ask electorates, ask publics to make sacrifices, to re-engineer the way our economies function in a profitable and beneficial way to the population at large? And one of the, if you like, tragedies of recent years for popular opinion in many countries, you can see, in a sense, is what drove Brexit, what drove Trump's election, and to some extent has created insurgent movements in the European Union too, is this sense of skepticism and disillusionment with political leadership, so-called experts, as it were, or experts, and as it were, the received wisdoms. And so now to ask people to make sacrifices, even if by the standards of the Second World War they're quite modest sacrifices, but to ask people who've been not, in a sense, asked to make sacrifices, but often found certain sections of society found that their economy, their locality, was being gutted by the collapse of the industry that fed the local population. To ask people like that now to make certain sacrifices, 5-6% on the cost of living, is going to be a big ask. But it's also it's the question that has to be answered positively if you are to re-energize our Western type of society.
Well, that was a beautiful ending. And Mark, I think that's an absolutely fascinating conversation. So thank you so much. I knew it would be. So thank you so much for
Well,
giving
thank
up
you.
your time.
No, well, thank you. Thanks for your questions and your points. Excellent. So,
And
Happy New
and if
Year.
people want to
I'm just
find,
trying
yes,
to-
and to you too. If very Merry Christmas. If people want to find you online, they can do so on Twitter. Yes, you
Yeah, yes, and then I probably will be guided to things that I've written, and they
which
can
are
then
always
make.
brilliant. I highly recommend them. So
I'm grateful for your endorsements. I'll get you to write a blurb on the back of a little book I'm
absolutely,
preparing about.
absolutely.
I just really think on this general theme we've talked about. It's called "The West and China, China and the Rest," and in a
Ah,
sense, it's looking at the tensions historically over the last, say, 100 years between the West and China, but also at how China, in particular in the last 30, 40 years, has suddenly exploded its role from being a primarily an inward-looking economy and society to being a globalized one, but a globalized one in a very different way from what Western thinkers about globalization thought 30, 40 years ago.
brilliant. Well, we look forward to that. Now,
Yeah,
after that, I'm sure you at home will be absolutely desperate to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell.
yeah.
And I'll see you after Christmas. Thank you very, very much. And of course, Mark, we must get you back on to talk about your new book when
Mm.
that's out. So thank you again very much.
Thank you, Darren. Thank you very much.